Good evening, guys. We'll get started with our review session. Hopefully, your weekend is going well, and as you guys are watching what the weather is doing, make sure tomorrow morning, especially with all the snow that's supposed to be coming in, that you are taking care of yourselves and taking your time when you come into school. But we'll get started with our review session. I don't see a lot of questions tonight, and so I'm hoping that that means that the content is going along for you well. But feel free to post any questions either on our message board, or else if I miss them during the video review session, send them as an email or a message. I can help you out with them in that way instead. We'll start with period 2 and work our way through periods 4 and 6 as well. But in period 2, we've got a few questions. Christian was asking a question that I think overlaps with Sam because he asked a question: what's going on with the Teller and the Platt Amendments, dealing with Chapter 27 with imperialism. So when you think about what's going on with the Spanish-American War, the whole reason for going into the Spanish-American War officially was the issues going on in Cuba. You had people like Jose Marti, who was pushing for independence. He was battling against the Spanish government. The USS Maine got blown up. And so when America went into the war, the imperialists were trying to counter the anti-imperialists, because the anti-imperialists were claiming that all we were doing was trying to steal land from other places. And so the Teller Amendment announced that the only reason why we were involved in the Spanish-American War in Cuba was to liberate the Cubans and give them freedom. What happened, though, was after the war was done, the Cubans did want to have independence, and being independent, they were making decisions that weren't 100% squared with what the United States wanted them to be doing. And so what was added on at the end of the Spanish-American War was something called the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment is going to say that Cubans are independent, but also the United States reserves the right to intervene in their business if it's in America's interest to do so. And it's a very wide open sort of opportunity for the United States to then have ongoing influence inside Cuba. And that's something we'll see taking place over decades afterwards, as America is going to be involved in nation building there. And eventually we will have a leader in Cuba that we like quite a bit up until the communist revolution in the 1950s. Let me see. The next question I see is with Christian, with the Ghost Dance. The Ghost Dance was taking place with the Plains Indians out west of here. And what was going on with the Ghost Dance was you had Native Americans who were engaging in activities that were meant to be religious ceremonies to harken back to the days of old. Many of them were of the belief that if they did the ghost dances, that it might have supernatural impacts, like either bringing back the ancestral old days or giving them protection from gunshots or something like that. But for the Native Americans, they're celebrating their faith and their culture in a way that was very much disturbing to the farmers who were living in the area with them. And so the farmers nearby asked for the United States government to step in and stop the ghost dance from taking place. And this is going to be the impetus for the massacre at Wounded Knee, where you're going to have Native Americans surrounded who are participating in these rituals, and eventually they'll be slaughtered in weather, much like what we've got going on outside for their beliefs. And so we'll find in the 1890s then this is going to be signaling the end of the Native American resistance out west, as that's the end of the battle phase. And when we take a look at the massacre at Wounded Knee, calling that's a battle is obviously a misnomer, like I mentioned to you in your lecture notes. TJ, what names are important for the test? There's a lot of them inside your textbook, and so I'm assuming that while you were reading, you were picking up on those. And so listing out every name is definitely not going to be something that we can be doing here. Let me take a look at period 4. Let me see here. Kirsten's got a question. How did farmers feel about the Indian Removal Acts, and what impact did they have on the farmers? When we think about the Indian Removal Act of like prior to the Civil War with Andrew Jackson, you had Southern planters who wanted that to take place, and that led to your Trail of Tears, moving Native Americans from the eastern frontier to the western frontier. You'll find that out west, farmers were very enthusiastic about moving Native Americans because they had the desire of taking over the land in order to be able to turn that into farmland. And especially for many of the farmers, they saw the Indians as being primitive because of the fact that they weren't cultivating the land the way that farmers would do back in Europe or the east coast of the United States. And so that was used as a rationale for why taking away the land wasn't bad, because the Indians seemed to not understand how to use it like Americans would. So when we take a look at the taking of land out west, that's going to allow then opening up of farmlands, the building of the railroads, and civilization for American culture spreading out west. Sorry, guys. Let me see here. Next question is, can I explain the Big Sister policy by James G. Blaine? James G. Blaine is the Secretary of State in the late 1800s who comes up with this idea that America should have a relationship with Latin American countries, almost like a big sister, to be taking care of them in times of need, especially because of the fact that in the late 1800s you had European countries that would lend money to Latin American countries, and then when they couldn't pay back their debts, they would then use that as an excuse to either influence or else try to invade those countries to expand their imperialistic holdings. And so what's happening is James G. Blaine, is not really standing up for these countries, but he's more seeing an opportunity that if anybody's going to use that economic leverage over the Latin American countries, it should be the United States as part of the Monroe Doctrine. And then when you read this chapter, when it starts getting into like Teddy Roosevelt's Roosevelt Corollary, he definitely believes that the United States should be the ones who are very much watching out for these sorts of economic situations so they can be the ones who benefit when a country gets into financial difficulty in Central America, South America, or the Caribbean. Let me see here. When it comes to President McKinley's plans of benevolent assimilation, what we're seeing going on then is McKinley is thinking about trying to figure out ways to take over territories that will then expand the reach of the United States. And this is what you saw going on with Mahan when he was talking about using the Navy to expand around the world to build up military influence. And it's with the idea of spreading American ideas like democracy, freedom, capitalism, Christianity. That's what you see at play with his philosophy there. Let's see here. Sam is asking if I can explain the difference between imperialists and anti-imperialists. Imperialists are the people who are in favor of us getting involved in European war. Not European. Wars outside the country or annexations outside the country to take over territories to make the United States bigger. They've got those economic, political, social, cultural reasons for why they want to expand, whether it's adding new markets or military bases or spreading American values. And the anti-imperialists are the ones who are opposing these movements into other countries because they feel like it's betraying American values, that it's got potential drawbacks going on with them. So those are the two groups that are battling in Chapter 27. But the imperialists are definitely going to end up winning out from 1890s all the way up to 1920 with the idea that America should be more involved in other countries to expand its influence. The other question that he was asking about the gold standard. And all the gold standard means is that if you have a gold standard with your money supply, you can only print the amount of money that you have inside your country that matches the amount of gold that you've got stored someplace within the United States Treasury. Discover more gold, you can print up more money, but what that means is there's a limit or a hard cap on how much money can be floating around, and that means that it's going to prevent inflation from taking place. You're not going to have an inflated money supply because there's only X number of dollars that are out there. If our population keeps going up, it's going to be harder and harder to get one of these dollars, and so you'll actually find prices dropping. It'll take less of those dollars to buy stuff, because as more people are chasing these dollars, they're becoming more valuable since they're locked into a limit that can be printed. That's why some people are talking about going with like a greenback or a silver policy so they can inflate the money supply and hopefully then have more dollar bills that are in circulation and hopefully drive up prices to help farmers get better prices and help them to repay their debts easier. Hope that helps. Feel free to post any follow-up questions you might have. Jason's question, how much do we need to know about American and Asian interactions? For example, do we need to know about the Open Door Note by John Hay? That is vitally important for Chapter 27. I just left it to you guys for the weekend because I found that the open door policy typically isn't all that confusing once you watch that documentary. But when we think about China, China is the longest existing consistent civilization on record, and they lived as a closed society, much like Japan did at the time that Matthew Perry arrived during the Fillmore presidency. What we'll find, though, is with China, they missed their industrial revolution along with Japan compared to when the Europeans and the Americans had it. And then on top of that, they had been dominated by the British with a gigantic conflict and an opium war. So they have now been heavily addicted to opium, which is corrupting and undermining their society. So by the time the Americans showed up, there were all these ports up along the eastern seaboard of China, but they had been largely claimed by different European countries. And all the Open Door note says is America comes in with John Hay and tells the people of the world, since America's friends with everybody and since we like trading with everybody, we're going to pass this open door policy where America can use any of the ports along the east coast of China to trade with the Chinese people. For the Europeans, they never agreed to this, but the problem that they had was at this point, America has now gone from where they were during the Revolution of being very weak. They now are one of the dominant navies in the world, kind of like Britain was at the time of the American Revolution. And so when they announced that they can trade at any port, any of the European countries could try to take them on, but the problem is America now has built up these navy bases across China, across the Pacific, especially Guam, and the Philippines. And so they can stage any sort of attacks along the east coast of China pretty easily. Not so much for the British or the Germans or others. It'd be much harder for their navy to be able to have that reach. And also, America's navy just cleaned out the Spanish. And so a lot of European countries are going to choose to abide by the open door policy rather than challenge the United States. And this is very much a hallmark of foreign policy. Sometimes foreign policy is if you're strong enough, you could then dominate. And other countries need to respect that because otherwise the consequence is war with a country that's very powerful. Let me see here. So Kirsten's got a question following up with that. What's the open door policy and the Boxer Rebellion? So the open door policy is what we just described a second ago. The Boxer Rebellion is an uprising that's going to take place by people who are in China, who are nationalistic, who love their country. They don't like Europeans coming in. They feel very nativistic and xenophobic, which means they're not really big fans of outsiders. And so when the Americans and others come in, there's going to be an uprising of these individuals. They aren't armed heavily. They've got martial arts skills. They've got martial arts style weapons. They believe that they can cloak themselves in a mystical force that will prevent bullets from killing them, which is definitely not going to work out well for them. But they stage an uprising. They go and attack many embassies in China, and eventually America plus Europeans are going to come in and put down that rebellion to protect the American and European influences in the area. If you notice nowadays, the ramifications of the open door policy, Boxer Rebellion, is you'll notice that China now is a rising power that isn't all that friendly to the United States, and in fact is behaving in many different ways with a trade war and stealing of intellectual property and that sort of stuff that demonstrates that China is very much not a big fan of what happened a century ago, and they would like to become the dominant power in that area rather than the United States or Europeans. Oh man, excuse me. Oh, my allergies just killed me tonight. All right, so next question. Anna's asking the question, how does inflation or deflation affect farmers? So when we think about this question, when it comes to inflation or deflation, if you've got a group of farmers, farmers are going to be growing a certain amount of food. The problem that they're going to have is they're going to be getting a price for that food, but we're going to build all sorts of new machines, and those new machines are going to up the amount of food that the farmers are producing. When the farmers start producing more food, and every farmer produces more food using the mechanical reaper and the railroads, and suddenly you've got now all of this food that's now available to purchase, everybody who's buying food now has more choices from more people who want to sell, and this food will spoil, so there's a limited amount of time to sell it. So the price of this food is all going to drop. Your problem with the farmers then is the farmers are watching their prices drop, which means the prices are deflating. And so deflation is what's happening to the farmers' prices. The problem is the machines that they bought for their farm, they have a loan that they have to pay back that is fixed. And so they have to pay the same amount every single month. And if every single month they have to pay a certain amount, but the amount of money they're getting for their food keeps dropping or deflating, then the farmers are in deep trouble. So what the farmers would like to do is they would like to start printing more money, gold money plus silver money plus greenbacks. And the hope is that having all of this money floating around is going to cause all of the money to become less valuable. It's going to then take more dollar bills to buy stuff like food, which means the price of food should go up. And that price that they owe for their loans is going to stay the same regardless of if it's being paid back up by gold money or if we're now paying it back with gold or silver or greenbacks. And so with this inflationary trend that they've got going on, they're hoping that they can jack up their prices so that they can then get enough money to pay off their loans during the Panic of 1893, so they can save themselves during that period. So their plan of like the silver scheme is something that's meant to inflate the price of farm goods so that they can then make enough money to pay off their loans to survive the panic. And that's what you see going on with this chapter. Hope that helps. If you have any sort of questions, that's very much a complicated question that a lot of kids wrestle with, so I'm glad that you asked. Maggie is asking about Granger laws. With Granger laws, the way to think about the Granger laws is they're being created by Grange movements in the middle part of the United States, especially in Illinois. What the Grangers wanted was they wanted to bust up railroad monopolies, regulate the rates that they were charging, and figure out ways to hopefully help out farmers to be able to get some protections from other sorts of monopoly impacts on them. The Granger laws that you saw were the ones that were happening with like the state of Illinois, regulating the rates of railroads that were running through their state. And you saw in the court case Munn versus Illinois that it was ruled legal or constitutional for the state to do that in the 1870s. We then read about the Wabash cases, though, where the Supreme Court is going to rule that it's not up to the states to create laws regulating monopolies that run railroads through multiple states. And that's where we created the Interstate Commerce Act with the Interstate Commerce Commission that was supposed to step in and regulate. But we also learned afterwards that that was so riddled with loopholes that it largely didn't do what it was supposed to do. So the Granger laws are an attempt at the state level to help farmers with anti-monopoly laws, but they're going to be limited because of the impacts of like Gilded Age influence of monopolies over the government that we discussed in class. So hopefully that helps out. If you have any more questions about that, please let me know. Matthew's question is, how was the mining industry significant? Was it monopolized? That question is really good for a couple different purposes. Number one, when it comes to mining out west, keep in mind what's going on with the mining. Like iron mining up in northern Minnesota is part of the vertical monopoly of Andrew Carnegie. And so that's an element that will be introduced into the monopolies of steel then buying up iron so they can have enough supply to create their stuff. Out west, you also learned about gold strikes happening in places like California, Denver, Alaska, the silver Comstock lode in Nevada, and all of those pieces of precious metal are going to be introduced into our currency debate that we had going on. And then when it came to actually looking for gold and silver, what would typically happen is somebody would find gold or silver in an area, and then they would mine it for a period of time, but pretty quickly a mining monopoly would come in, and they would come in with heavy equipment that a little small-time miner could not provide, and they would then engage in like hydraulic mining, blasting away the side of a mountain to wash it away and find the minerals, or to do deep underground mining, and they would usually be the ones who would then be running the big business that would be extracting the ore, but then there would be other big businesses that would be selling all the supplies to the mining companies and the miners that would also be getting rich off of that strike. Matthew's also asking about the four-party system, and what you mean by that is the fourth party system, not the four-party system. And so when you think about your party system so far, what you've learned about, oh, yikes. First of all, Federalist versus Democratic Republicans during the time of Washington, that is your first party system. And that's going to be around all the way up until the era of good feelings, when we're going to have only one party when the Federalist Party ends up dying out. Your second party system is going to be Whigs versus Jacksonian Democrats from the time of Andrew Jackson up through the Civil War. And they're largely wrestling over the issue of sectionalism. But that's going to wipe out right before the Civil War gets started when the Whig Party disintegrates. Your third party system is Republicans versus Democrats, dealing with the issues of sectionalism, and then also getting into the issues of the Gilded Age. In the late 1800s, though, this is where you see the emergence of your fourth party system, where we're about to see the Democratic Party merge together with the populists and become much more reform-minded. They'll still be conservative Southern Democrats, but by the time we get to the late 1800s, we have now totally put the ideas of Republican and Democrats, sectionalism, slavery, in the rear window. And we're finding that in the late 1800s, there really wasn't much to define what made a Republican and Democrat different during our third party system. But during our fourth, we're about to study over the upcoming week the progressives that will definitely show us a more reform-minded political party set in both the Republican and Democratic Party, and they're about to cause a lot of shifting to take place in the parties themselves. So just knowing that that's out there, it's not a vital term to understand, but it is something to show you that we are about to have another turning point when it comes to political parties as we start moving ourselves to more modern times. Meg's got a question. What was Roosevelt's role in the war between Japan and Russia? Japan and Russia in the Russo-Japanese War went to war with one another during the Teddy Roosevelt presidency. Russia went into the war with ideas of nationalism, racial superiority, and the idea that the Japanese couldn't possibly hang with them because the Japanese must be inferior to them racially and ethnically. And what happened was the Russians had not industrialized the way that the Japanese did, and the Japanese cleaned the Russians out like crazy. And so in the Russo-Japanese War, Russia and Japan are going to be battling over places like Manchuria and other sorts of places on the eastern seaboard of Asia. And for the Russians and the Japanese, they're willing to get out of the war during the Teddy Roosevelt presidency, so he's going to win the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating an end to the Russo-Japanese War. He's going to create a treaty at Portsmouth on the east coast of the United States. But what's funny about the treaty itself is for Japan, they wanted to end the war because they were just done. They'd done everything they wanted to do. They pounded on the Russians really hard, and they really wanted to get out of the war to focus on other sorts of imperialistic adventures. Meanwhile, the Russians were just getting clobbered. So Teddy Roosevelt negotiates a treaty between Russia and Japan, but then he also takes his Great White Fleet, and that's what you read about in Chapter 27, where he sent a fleet around the world using our new naval bases and other bases around the world to demonstrate to the world that our brand new Navy could show up on anybody's doorstep and engage in gunboat diplomacy, which means we could have a gunboat on the shore of your country with troops like Marines that can come ashore pretty easily. And so you don't want to mess with the United States. And this is what he referred to as being his big stick. So his big stick diplomacy was the argument that you speak softly, you carry a big stick. If anybody messes with you, you whack them with your big stick. And in this case, your big stick is your Navy. And that way other countries will respect us. So when they signed the Russo-Japanese War, Teddy Roosevelt took both sides out to the coast, and then at that time, the Great White Fleet for the United States went steaming by, and it showed the Russians and the Japanese in a very simple and effective way his message that they're now done fighting, but if they want a piece of the United States, America's got weapons that they're willing to use, and they're not afraid to use them, and so he was using a bit of intimidation. So what you see going on there is kind of the beginnings of this tension that's building up between Japan and the United States that's eventually going to result in Pearl Harbor with World War II. Hope that helps. If you got any other questions, let me know. I'm now scanning through, let me see here, period 4. Lou, I see your question. Can I explain the rebellion in Hawaii and the international conflicts going on during the building of the Panama Canal? Sure. So what you've got going on with Hawaii is Hawaii originally was a place where missionaries were going. There were a lot of people who would go to Hawaii because the climate was so nice. Like they had a leper colony in the area that they had set up for people with leprosy so that they could then live in that area with a tropical climate so that they could be protected but also isolated. Eventually what starts happening is Americans start moving into the island, creating plantations, growing tropical fruit, but they really hate the idea that when they try to ship stuff from Hawaii back to America, Hawaii at that time technically is not an American possession, so it's outside the American tariff wall. So if they try to send stuff like pineapples or bananas back to the United States, they're running into a massive tariff, like your McKinley tariff that you learned about. And so what they're going to be doing is they're going to be pushing to see if America will invade or annex Hawaii. And what it has is the perfect combination of things that will make the United States interested. They've got Pearl Harbor to be a perfect naval base. They've got this great area to be a coal coaling station on the way across the Pacific Ocean. So this is one of the first places that imperialists start looking. And then when you take a look at the Hawaiian culture was getting overwhelmed in numbers by the Americans who were moving in. And with their culture, they were very friendly and open with people who were arriving, which was seen as a negative for them. They were seen as not as capitalistic as people from the United States. So that was seen as a disadvantage. And so when Sanford B. Dole, with the help of the United States Navy, was able to topple Liliuokalani, they could then annex that country into the United States during the McKinley presidency. So that's what happened with the rebellion in Hawaii. When it came to the Panama Canal, there were all sorts of treaties that were going on between the British and the United States because they were battling over the Monroe Doctrine. And in big picture, they were battling over who would be dominant over the Latin American countries. They had been making deals where both countries and France had been thinking about building a canal through Central America, and they had passed treaties with one another to keep each side from building a canal that would be only available to one country and would be fortified by that country. Those treaties held up until the time of Teddy Roosevelt, and then Teddy Roosevelt was able to stage a coup in the area of Panama, and with the new Panamanian government, he was able to create a deal that would build the Panama Canal. It was going to be an American canal. It was going to be open for other countries to use, but it was created because the Navy was so strong that nobody could really push back on Teddy Roosevelt when he announced that we were going to start building a canal that would be an American canal, even though in the past there had been all these turf wars about that territory. So that's why what you see going on with the Panama Canal was such a highlight for Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt felt like in the past too many presidents had asked for permission rather than actually just taking control of the situation. So he staged a rebellion in Panama. He encouraged it. He got started with the Panama Canal, and when he rammed it through Congress, he pointed out he didn't ask for permission. He asked for forgiveness afterwards, but he got it done. And then afterwards, when everybody's wringing their hands about, oh gosh, could Teddy Roosevelt do that? Kind of like you saw with the American system where Henry Clay threw out to James Madison and Monroe that we should start building roads. Those guys got really timid and they're like, man, I don't know if that's constitutional. Teddy Roosevelt is different. He is going to take on a lot more presidential power because he thinks he can. And he's the type of person who is a different type of president. Instead of being like Madison Monroe and being deeply worried about what is or is not constitutional, Teddy Roosevelt really likes Andrew Jackson's viewpoint that instead the president does what he thinks is right, then he convinces the country that he's right, and if it means stretching the Constitution, he believes in the elastic clause, and he believes that government should function to do things for the people that they cannot do for themselves. It's this mentality that's going to make him loved by some, hated by others, because there are others who are going to see him massively building up the power of the United States government and the presidency through his actions. So hopefully that helps out the Panama Canal. I'll be checking to see if any other questions pop up. So that's the end of my questions for period 4 that I'm seeing right now. So let's move on to period 6. Hallie, first of all, hopefully that helped you out because can see your question asking about explaining the Panama Canal, and hopefully my explanation of what was going on with the open door has also helped you out as well too. Jack is asking a question saying, what are Latin American debt defaults that prompted Teddy Roosevelt to exert control over South America? So what you will see going on there is what we described with the big sister policy. Straightforward, what's going to happen is there are going to be Latin American countries that will be engaged in rebellions or civil wars, and they will oftentimes need money to help them get through those circumstances. They would oftentimes take out loans from countries like Britain or France or Germany, and England and France and Germany would extend these loans not because they were excited about getting repaid, and in fact a lot of times they were anticipating that they would not get a repayment. If they didn't get repaid by a country though, many of those European countries would then hold that debt as an excuse for them getting involved militarily inside that country to try to exert influence over them in an imperialistic sort of way. What Teddy Roosevelt is going to argue is he's going to argue that because of the Monroe Doctrine, and then also his brand new Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, he's going to argue that the United States is the protector of all the Americas. And what he means is if one of those Latin American countries gets into a financial difficulty with another European country, it doesn't mean that they're forgiven of their debts, but instead of coming to collect it themselves, England or France or Germany are going to be expected to ask the United States to step in and intervene. And what that means is America then might be able to reap the benefits of that financial instability so they can then move in and become dominant inside that country. They would then turn around and repay the French or the British or the Germans, but then they would be the ones in possession of like a Dominican Republic or Haiti or something like that. And that's what you see happening at the end of chapter 27, is Teddy Roosevelt is now playing around with that ability where he's trying to mimic what the Europeans are up to, but he's couching it with the idea that when America takes over, we're the good guys spreading democracy and capitalism and Christianity to these countries. So we're spreading all these good American ideas, even though we are going to be imperialistically dominating them by using their markets, selling stuff to them, and being very much in a dominant situation rather than an equal sort of situation. Isabella, I see your question about the federal sub-treasury, and this question's a really good one. It has to do with the populace in chapter 26. And so what I want you to imagine is think about what's going on with farmers. And so you've got farmers, and sadly my pen is dying out, so I'm all sorts of struggling tonight. So imagine you've got this really bad looking farmer right here, and they're working on their farm and they get in trouble, and what's going to happen is they're going to go and ask the bank for a loan. But when they ask the bank for a loan at the end of the summer, because of the fact that they're hitting tough times and they've got prices that are bad for them, the farmers aren't going to get good interest rates. Banks issue loans, and they can offer high or low interest rates depending on how good of a borrower you are, and also based on how many other people are asking for the same dollars in a loan. So if you got a bunch of people all asking for loans at the same time, you can increase the interest rate you're charging because you got people competing against one another to be a borrower. So what's being asked for with the federal sub-treasuries idea is the populace in the late 1800s are asking to create a federal sub-treasury system where this is a government financial institution that is holding a bunch of American dollars. And what they want them to be able to do is when times get tough for farmers, especially during panics, they want this institution to be able to offer low interest loans to farmers. And the reason why they're asking for this is they're saying they're not bad people and they don't ask for money for frivolous things. They just will only ask when they need it, and without the farmers, everybody starves. And so the idea is, can't the government do something to help out the farmers so they're not being attacked by these banking monopolies that are taking advantage of them? What they also ask for, though, at the same time period is they ask the United States government to build grain elevators for them too. And if you ever drive through farm country inside Minnesota, you'll find these large towers next to the train tracks in many small towns. Those are grain elevators. So what will happen is the farmers will bring in their grain. They'll then make a deposit of that grain inside that grain elevator. And what the farmers are asking for is they're asking the government to build a series of these, because when they all go to sell their grain at the same time in September, when everybody's selling simultaneously, the price drops because everybody is trying to sell at the same moment. They're asking the government, can they build these places so that people can put their grain there until like October, November, December, January, so the grain price will drop? And then hopefully when it pops back up again a month or 2 or 3 later, they can then get better prices for their food, which will help them out. Not because they're getting anything special, they're just waiting for a bit until the market's better for them. And if they can get that, and they can also get these federal sub-treasuries to give them loans instead of having to go to a bank that's going to give them really nasty interest rates type loans, the government doesn't need to give them handouts. They can just build a structure right here to allow the farmers to be successful. They still want to be hardworking. They don't want handouts or anything like that, but they're asking for a structure to be built to help them to be able to do business. And what the farmers are arguing is that this and this is not that much more of an ask than when the railroads demanded land and money to go build a transcontinental railroad, or tariffs were built for big monopolies. But what they're going to find is that when the government gets involved, the government was very helpful with like railroads or steel industry or banking. They're not going to be willing to help out the farmers, with the argument that they're going to make them then dependent on the government for getting their stuff done. And so this is what's radicalizing the farmers. They don't feel like they're asking for much, but the government is doing nothing for them. And then during the Panic of 1893, they get rid of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, and everything seems to be going wrong. And that's why the farmers are so mad. So hopefully that helps out. If you got any other questions, let me know. Let me see here. We've covered Hallie's question about building the Panama Canal and the open door policy. When it comes to the vital battles to know during the Spanish-American War, there aren't a ton. When you think about the Spanish-American War, they describe it as a splendid little war, so you need to know about the entry point, yellow journalism, and the USS Maine, Jose Marti asking for aid from the United States government. But then when we take a look at the war itself, you have Admiral Dewey in the Philippines wiping out the Spanish Navy very quickly. You have the battle at San Juan Hill, also technically Kettle Hill, where Teddy Roosevelt's going to become a national hero for storming up the side of this hill to attack a Spanish encampment. But largely the Spanish are overwhelmed within just a couple weeks of fighting, and the United States is able to conquer a major colonial power from Chapter 2. They're able to do it in less than a year, and so this is going to be something that is very much something that builds American nationalism and feelings of American exceptionalism for being able to pull this off. Now, right afterwards, you'll want to know about how the Spanish-American War becomes then the Philippine-American War, where Emilio Aguinaldo is going to argue that he's fighting for independence, and he will turn on the Americans when he realizes America is planning on using the Philippines as a military base and a market, and they don't see the people of the Philippines as being ready for democracy. And in reality, what's happening in America is they also recognize that if America leaves the Philippines independent, Japan or Europeans will want to take this over because it's such a prime place for imperialism, so close to China with the new open door policy. So hopefully that helps out with what's going on with the Spanish-American War. There isn't a lot of key major battles like you'll find with like the Civil War, the American Revolution. And your question was a really good one to ask. Let me see here. Brooke, can I explain the final results of U.S. intervention in Latin American affairs from Chapter 27? You'll notice that they kind of leave you hanging. Ugh. And it's intentional for why they do that, because we have got then the start of imperialism that's going to continue with William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. So what you see happening with Chapter 27 with Teddy Roosevelt will have his big stick diplomacy, like you saw in the Chapter 27 documentary that you guys finished up over this weekend. He is going to use his Navy to take over, to influence places in Latin America, and you saw that during his time, he's going into different countries to put down insurrections, instability, financial issues. When we move on to William Howard Taft, and we're going to be studying him in chapters 28 and 29, Taft is going to be involved in doing the same, but instead of big stick diplomacy, he's going to use dollar diplomacy. So his idea is he's going to try to insert American businesses into countries around the world and use them to influence the politics and economy of a country so that they become really tightly knit with the United States. He also will be involved in a number of military interventions that are going to be happening in Latin America. And then with Woodrow Wilson, he's going to believe a third different philosophy called moral diplomacy, which is the idea that America is a good country, other countries are bad countries, and it's our duty to spread good things about America like democracy, freedom, capitalism, Christianity to other countries around the world. And you're going to see him especially doing that in Mexico, where he is going to actually stage an invasion in Mexico because they have a coup where their leader is taken out. A new leader is put into place. You have a dictatorship that's established. It's very tight with Germany. At the same time, World War I's going on. So your question is a really good one, but we don't really have an end point that comes in with imperialism in Chapter 27. They will just include in Chapters 28 and 29 little side stories about Taft continuing imperialism and Wilson doing the same. And then once we get past World War I, there's a feeling in the United States that we've gone too far, and after 30 years of imperialism, we will then kind of pull back from the world in the 1920s, still having our influences in places that we've influenced to that point. But there's a pullback from imperialism because there's a feeling that maybe we haven't been living up to the idea of American standards, and there's also a feeling that we got burned by World War I, which you'll see again over the next couple weeks when we study that content. So hopefully that helps out. If there's anything more you need to know, I think you're on the right track asking what you're asking, but I also don't think that fully running that to its endpoint is going to be necessary for tomorrow's test. I think you'll be good just understanding the events that are happening in the chapter. So I don't see any more questions for period 6. I don't see any more for period 2. And I do not see any more for period 4. So hopefully that means that you guys are good for the test tomorrow. Again, if you are one of my young drivers, be really careful when you come into school tomorrow. We've got some kids who drive crazy because kids sometimes drive crazy. So watch your speed tomorrow, and especially gauge what's going on with the snow. And it's also supposed to be nasty cold, and so hopefully you take it slow tomorrow. I look forward to seeing you then. If you've got hopes of school closing, I do not anticipate that that's going to be happening tomorrow, although I've got some people that I know who are super excited about later on this week with the idea of possibly having a snow day or a cold day, but I don't know if that's going to pay off for my daughter and son, but they are telling me that they're certain that that's going to take place. So we'll see if that happens. If it does, I'll probably have something electronic, because we are at the point of the year where we really can't be taking days off without doing anything, because of the fact that we are in such a tough time frame getting us from here to May with our content being covered. So that's getting a little bit ahead of myself. Again, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Stay warm. Thanks for participating tonight. If you got any other questions, feel free to email. Have a good night, guys.